Hello learners. As you all know, we've been talking about the Indian English literature and the various concepts, or I should say we're trying to understand how Indian English poetry evolved. We've been talking about the origin of Indian English poetry. We've also tried to understand the background of Indian English poetry while tracing the history of its origin. We've also had a module and tried to understand the various influences of British colonization on the evolution of Indian English poetry. Today, we are going to talk about the growth of Indian English poetry and how have we been able to divide it, or I should say periodize Indian English poetry into various ages. I am Anamika Shukla from the School of Humanities at Indira Gandhi National Open University. So let's begin to talk about, before we talk about the periodization, let me try and explain what periodization is all about. As you all understand, periodization primarily refers to the practice of dividing a long literary tradition into, I should say, convenient phases or time slots. Now, this has been done in different ways. As we examine the history of English literature, you will understand this, the set periods that we've all been reading about, that we've been learnt while doing our English programs. We come across the Elizabethan age, the 17th century, the Augustans, the Romantics, and so on. So, I would suggest that usually there is more than one way to classify the history of literature. So, for instance, when we examine the history of English literature, what we normally find out is, it usually proceeds along certain set periods, as we've been talking about. We come across the Elizabethan age. We also talk about the Augustans, the 17th century, the Romantics, and so on. So, I would suggest that usually there is more than one way of classifying the history of literature. Now, when we talk about English literature, we normally have been identifying the ages with the monarchs who used to rule. So, that is why we have Victorian literature. We also talk about the Georgian literature, the Edwardian literature, and so on. So now, as I've been talking about, we classify literature primarily on two different bases. One is we kind of, relate them with the ages. Secondly, we relate them with the ruling monarchs. So, that is how we have these Victorian and Georgian and other kind of ages when we read the history of literature. Now, when we talk about, see what happens is there is a literary movement which is sufficiently distinctive from the ruling monarch, and I should say the ruling monarch was not as powerful as the literary movement was. So then we could, name that literary period on the basis of the movement, and therefore the phases evolved or the ages evolved, and namely we could refer them to as the metaphysical poets or the Romantics. That is how this classification came. So nowadays, it's not a practice. We do not identify literature with the monarchs ruling the nation. Now, what we need to understand is that periodization, now why is it essential? Why do we need to periodize literature? So, there are more than one reasons. One would be we need to understand that periodization is essential because it becomes a convenient device to help us understand and also study a large body of text. So we need some kind of classification, some kind of division, or some kind of categorization so that we can understand what are the different phases that we're going to study. How did, the movement happen? How did we move from the earlier phase to the later phase? And what were the changes? How did we evolve in the process? So, primarily to make our study convenient, we embark upon this process of periodization. Now, I should also say that it helps us organize a literary tradition. Now, when it comes to, so this is what we've been doing. We've been dividing the English literature into various ages, into various periods. Now, the argument is, when we talk about a very young literature, relatively a young literature like the Indian English literature, is it necessary or is it useful to periodize? How useful or necessary is the periodization of Indian English literature? So this is what we're going to talk about, and it's quite a valid question. So, but again, it is challenging, because the challenge of having to periodize our literature is how do we go about it? We all know that there were massive changes in the literary styles and the tastes of the people. When we move from the early decades of this century to the present decade, the changes have been massive. There have been change in taste, there have been change in literary traditions. So that is why we need to categorize it. Yes, definitely the eruption of modernism in Europe and also elsewhere is something which we need to refer to. Now, there was a widespread and multifaceted transformation across several arts, across literature, across cultures, across society, across practices. So, there is a marked change in the poetry which was written by the modernists. I should, to name a few, I would say T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and that of their predecessors. So, how do I invoke this term modernism? Because it is going to help you understand and explain this change, how this change happened, how did we move towards the modern poetry writers. So, that is how, when we read this history of modernism, we kind of understand, and it also helps us to periodize the tradition of English poetry. Now, a similar change took place in the taste. I should say a similar change in taste is discernible in Indian English poetry when we move from, say, Sarojini Naidu to Nazim Ezekiel. How are we to account and how do we need to describe this change? So, that is how we need to resort to some sort of periodization for the entire tradition of Indian English poetry. And I should say it becomes, very, very imperative to periodize Indian English poetry. Yes, we also notice, or we also need to keep in mind the complications that arise when we deal with the Indian English literature. For instance, there seems to be a parallel in our literature to what happened in English literature. That is the change that occurred with modernism. There's such a large lag between us and the British. For example, I should say the shift in poetic idiom that took place in Europe, it took place somewhere in the 1920s. But in India, when we talk about India, it happened pretty late, somewhere in the 1950s. So, the two questions that immediately come to our mind is, what accounts for this time lag? Now, as given, this time lag, when we talk about this time lag, can we really use the same, basis, or can we use this same wide hemisphere, wide understanding when we are trying to categorize English poetry or periodize English poetry? Can we use the same basis? Can we use the same understanding when we are doing so for Indian English poetry? Primarily, the answer is simple. In fact, very complex issues of literary influence and cross-cultural interactions can also be addressed when we talk about this very question. All right, let us, come up with some very easy way of, I would like to suggest an easy method of identifying or what do you call that, periodization of Indian English poetry. Let us approach have a very simple approach in a very simple manner. See, you can always explore all kinds of complexities. There is a fundamental fact that we have to bear in mind when we are studying Indian English poetry. It is at once similar to, and at times, the two things go simultaneously. It is similar and also different from English poetry. It is similar in certain ways and also different in certain other ways. Now, our understanding will be enriched in direct proportion to how actually we can identify these similarities and at the same time underline the differences. Now, we need to specify the similarities and also identify the differences. Now, how do we do that? When we do so, we should also bear in mind that things that are what is true for Indian English poetry stands true, though in varying degrees, for other colonial and also post-colonial literatures. So let us consider, for example, if I give you a very small example of, say, American literature. Now, what happens is, though America ceased to be a colony of Britain, but it's after the famous Declaration of Independence, the fact that American literature continued to be influenced by the literary trends of Britain. And this happened for more than, a century. So, we also argue that it still continues to have that, a symbiotic relationship with Europe. So what we see in American literature is something which is reflected, which is a reflection of the major trends in the British and the European literature. So, for example, you have Puritan literature in Britain, you also have Puritan literature in America. Similarly, you have neoclassical literature in Britain, so you also have neoclassical literature in America, romantic literature in Britain, and we also have romantic literature in America. So what I'm trying to say is that even after independence, the so-called Declaration of Independence, the American literature continues to be influenced by the literary trends from Britain. It still continues, in fact, I should say. So there is a symbiotic relationship between Europe and America. So, same applies to Indian English literature. The point that I'm trying to make is that though American Puritanism, the neoclassicism, or I should say the romanticism, is similar to that of Britain, but it is not identical. It may be similar, it may be influenced by the Britishers, but it is not identical. The two are actually quite different, in a sense. Unless and until you do not properly understand what happened in American literature, without being aware of the happenings in British literature, So what I would say is that Americanness of American literature is seen in the way in which it, I should say, adapts and also adopts, and at the same time resists. So it is simultaneously adapting, it is simultaneously adopting, and also resisting the dominant influences from Europe. So and this, it does not just in one manner, not in the manner in which it imitates, but it also reproduces them. So what we're trying to understand is, again, I would like to emphasize the fact that the influences of Britain, the European influences, or the influences of the major trends in British literature may be similar, but they are not identical. And it also varies. These influences also varies the way the other literature adapts it, adopts it, and also resists it. So it is, a final product out of the three processes that take place simultaneously. Now let us try and understand how it works with Indian English literature, or primarily we are talking about Indian English poetry. Now, in Indian English poetry, we find this tendency to reflect the dominant idiom of English and also of American poetry, but at the same time, it has the capability to retain, or I should say, not totally lose its individuality. Though some critics have gone to the extent of saying that all Indian English poetry is a derivative in totality, but I personally believe, or there are critics, there are literary stalwarts who believe that Indian English poetry has definitely reflected the dominant idiom of English and American poetry, but it has also, retained its own individuality. It has, succeeded in culminating in a narrative which we can call Indian English poetry without totally losing its individuality. An extreme example, I would say, of this is Rajiv Patke, who makes a case in canons and also canon making in Indian poetry in English. Another reasonable view is found in M.K. Nayak's Echo and Voice. We need not get into all these, the details, but what we need to be aware that Indian English poetry, to a large extent, definitely has been shaped by forces from outside. It has been influenced, it has, we've been talking about in the earlier modules about the influence of British colonization. So definitely the British colonization has influenced our culture, our society, and so is the case with Indian English poetry. So, I would again and again argue and try and make you aware of the fact that Indian English poetry, to a large extent, has been shaped by the forces from outside our own culture. But the forces, which were interior to the literary and cultural diaspora of the language itself, and that is, obviously here it is English. It is quite natural for the Indian English poets to be influenced by British poets and British poetry. Some of our poets did not go, beyond imitation, but others, this doesn't apply to the entire brigade of poets, but there were others who did succeed, who did develop a strong, distinctive voice of their own. It is also important to see the complexity of this relationship between the so-called the Indian English poetry and the British poetry. So it is, I would suggest that it is not just a relationship of inequality and dominance in which the British sensibility shaped its Indian counterpart or Indian poetry, but it's also a relationship of exploration. There's also a happening of mutuality. There's also an ever-growing resistance. So there are a lot of influences or lot of factors that influenced the shaping of Indian English poetry. Now, there are things in Indian English poetry which cannot be found, but still, as I've been talking earlier, that it is not similar, it may be identical. At the same time, it's not imitation. It has its own strong and distinctive voice. It has succeeded in retaining its originality. Now, we also, I would like to give you an example, certain examples, perhaps Savitri, which is an epic by Sri Aurobindo. We also talk about, there are a lot of examples that can be given that can be, help us understand the resistance which shaped the Indian English poetry. So, it is very clear that probably one way of periodizing Indian English poetry is, we find an equivalent for the major trends and the movements in British poetry. This definitely is a useful exercise, but probably there's another way also. So the usual course of British poetry, say from the early 19th century, that we've come across is like neoclassicism, romanticism, moving on to late romantic or the Victorian poetry, and then modern poetry. Now, what I'm trying to make you understand is not all these phases are primarily formed in Indian English poetry. Now, this is because there was very little, Indian English poetry has a lesser volume in the first place. And another important reason is that Indian English poetry or Indian English poets were responding not only to the literary trends from Britain, but also the political and the cultural trends in our own country. So, they were simultaneously working on two different fields, two different fronts, I would suggest. They were also responding to the literary trends of the Britishers or the British poetry, and also, responding to the political and the cultural happenings in our own country. And that is why the relationship of poetry and the state in which it is being written is very important to understand. So and I would suggest that it also might be useful to bring yet another influential point while debating periodization is because a lot depends on who is attempting to periodize. The attempt of periodizing literature is being attempted by who is doing it. So what is the politics of periodization? The modernists, for example, have only two periods of Indian English poetry. They talk about themselves and those who were writing before them, who went before them. Now, these modernists, you should say, starting from Ezekiel and going on to nearly all the major poets living today. When we talk about Shiv K. Kumar, we can also talk about Daruwala, Salim Piradina, and R. Parthasarthi, all those, Arvind Krishnan, Mehrotra, and so on. So now they make a basic claim. They talk about Indian English poetry beginning with the modernists somewhere in the 1950s. Now, poetry that was written before that, poetry which was written, say, from Derozio to Sri Aurobindo, was never studied. So, in a sense, such poetry, they normally claim it to be akin to something as a juvenile poetry. Now, this is a very, very different kind of an opinion. Now, older Indian English poetry was the juvenile poetry, or the juvenile stage of the genre itself, which was only fit for historical records and interests. And they say that the real poetry, which had some kind of value, or which had some kind of importance, or which gave some kind of message to the society, was only of the modernists. Now, this is a very typical opinion which we need to which we attempt to kind of question again and again. You know what the modernists achieved was that they were able to divide all the Indian English poetry into two periods: the pre-modernists, or they call them the traditionalists, and definitely the modernists. Now, they kind of tried and flattened out the similarities between themselves and their predecessors by emphasizing a certain kind of poetry as representative of the modernism, and they also approached the best of the poets who came after them into the modernist camp. Now, the result, now what happened was, this two group of poets, in whom all the older poets are kind of othered, and all the non-modernists contemporaries were being rejected. It talks about probably it doesn't come up or sum up the purpose of periodization. So, there is a more useful way of periodizing Indian English poetry. See, a better or a more useful way of periodizing Indian English poetry, which does not rely so much on the poetics, but instead on the politics of Indian English poetry. So, this periodization, as I have been again and again talking about, depends more on the relationship between the poetry and the processes of state formation. This is why what Indian English poetry, as I suggest, can be divided into three broad phases. We can categorize them as proto-nationalists, nationalists, and post-nationalists. The first phase, which was, which started with Derozio and going up to the end of the 19th century. It corresponds to the period in Indian history in which nationalism was being consolidated. Then we talk about the nationalist phase, which supposedly can be divided, can begin from 1900 to 1950s, where we have poets like Ravindranath Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, and Sarojini Naidu. All of these were engaging in the battle against colonialism. And finally, we have the post-nationalist phase, which began in the 1950s, and where we talk about poets like Nazim Ezekiel, and because they were the ones who went on not only to question nationalism, but they also, they took I would say they retreat from large public themes to individual and private agonies. So, of course, we can say that this phase corresponds with the literary modernism. Now, and one more thing that I would like to mention here is that post-nationalism itself can be divided into two phases: 1950s to 1980s, and yes, 1980s onwards. So, in the later phase, we have poets like Vikram Seth, where we find a new diasporic consciousness which is kind of dominating the Indian English poetry. So, so we've been dividing this Indian English poetry into these kind of different ages or different periods. So, there has been a mixture of both poetic and political criteria. but there's also an overlapping of dates or overlapping of ages. But the ultimate purpose is what we are trying to do is, we're trying to come up and acknowledge an accepted way of periodizing an Indian English poetry. We need to kind of adapt a manner or a method which appeals and satisfies us, so that we are able to understand how do we identify the different trends of the period, the different happenings in the society and in the country, which is being reflected in the poetry of the times. So, in the entire module, we've been trying to understand how has Indian English poetry influenced by the British poetry, influenced by the American poetry. So in those terms, it has been influenced, but to a certain extent, and it has also been successful in retaining its identity, in retaining its individuality. And also simultaneously, at the same time, it is also a response. It is also an answer to the various social, political and cultural happenings in the country. So we need to understand and also read Indian English poetry, keeping in mind these different aspects or these different parameters, and this is how, for us, the periodization also becomes easy, and it also becomes easy to understand the complex web, and the complex relation of the cultural and political forces which unfolded, in this genre of writing. So that's all for today. I suppose it must have been an entertaining and an interesting experience, where we are trying to understand, how did this Indian English poetry grow and evolve into a successful medium, which could help us understand the complex scenario, or I should say the complex cultural, political and civilizational issues of our country. Thank you for today.